Before we introduce our next speakers, I do want to take care of a couple little administrative areas. Am I on back there? Can you hear me? You good? Okay, thank you. So just a couple things I wanted to point out. First of all, you may not have noticed that in the back of the room over near the coffee area by the easel, there's a brand new plaque on an easel. It's a proclamation from the state of Indiana congratulating CERIAS on 20 years of great work. And so our state senator, 2 state representatives surprised us with that this week, and we're very proud of that. So, and all of you in this room should be as well. I also wanted to point out that if you are needing instructions about CPE credits for these 2 days, and also for yesterday if you attended the Cyber Physical Security Day, out at the registration table there's some papers that talk about how many credits you could request for each day. So that information is out at the table, so I want to make sure we mention that as well. I thought it was amazing when I saw that panel discussion before lunch, the amount of talent setting up at that table. And then I look out over the crowd and I say, there's a lot of talent out at this table as well. I could not imagine the number of years of experience we have. And it kind of brought to my attention that CERIAS is now 20 years old. There are people in the audience who were not born yet when CERIAS was founded. And what I also want to point out was this is the highest registration number we've ever had. We're nearly 400 registrants for this conference, so we're really high on that. And what I wanted to do is, where's my friend Henry Olson? So Henry is a high school student, so I'm going to guarantee that he has not been around as long as CERIAS has. He was also the very first registration to the conference when the site opened up. So Henry, I've got a T-shirt for you. So don't leave without coming and getting your T-shirt for me. Okay, so it's my privilege to introduce 2 great faculty members that are going to talk to you a little bit this morning. I won't go into their pitch at all, but both Saurabh and CERIAS have been outstanding CERIAS members, and they've done some tremendous work, and I think you'll enjoy what they're going to talk about this morning. So I'll just turn it over to them.
Thank you, Jerry. Good afternoon. It's great to see so many people here in the audience when you could be outside in this brilliant day doing something more fun. But we are going to tell you a little bit about embedded security, Shreyas and I. The good news is embedded devices, embedded systems are all around us. So, for example, if you rode the elevator to come here, you relied on about between 10 to 25 different embedded devices on your way up here to get you here safely and on time. If you drove a car to here, you relied on anything between 80 to 100 embedded devices to get you here. If you flew here, you relied on about 500 embedded devices to get you here. And if you're a back to the basics kind of a guy, you trudged your way here, then you did not rely on any embedded device. So whether it's safe or secure, it doesn't really matter to you. But for all the others, security of embedded devices does matter to you. And we're going to tell you a little bit about that. So here's a high-level vision for the security of embedded systems. So these embedded systems are all around us. And it's critical that these embedded systems function properly so that the mission objectives are met. These embedded systems have this somewhat of a unique characteristic that they have a cyber part to them. They're programmable, they run code, they run on hardware. And then they have a physical part to them in that they sense the environment around them, they sense various physical phenomena around them, and then there is a connection between the cyber part and the physical part. Based on the sensed values, they may do something in terms of the control flow that the program takes. So you want to secure the cyber part, the physical part, as well as the connections between the two in order to secure embedded systems. So the vision that the community has for secure development of embedded systems can be summarized in these manners. So we want to have some rigorous design principles so that security can be built into the code bases of these embedded devices. So it's not just something which is patched on, but something which is a first-order entity right from the design time. Then you want to have some real-time self-diagnostics when the device is working in the field in order to be able to detect when there is a problem, in order to perform root cause analysis, and then automatically to isolate the effect of this attack. So that's the real-time, the runtime component of it. Then the third key challenge that the community has is because of various reasons, including commercial reasons. These are typically individual devices, can be fairly cheap, and some embedded devices are very expensive as well. Then there is a very strong time to market compulsion. So for these reasons, oftentimes you don't have the luxury of protecting absolutely every single asset that you have in your system. So then you need to make strategic, rational decisions about what you will protect and what you're going to leave as is without bringing down the security of the overall system. And then as the system is operating, bad things are going to happen. And you would expect that the devices, the networks, the systems can self-heal so that the mission of your application can still be met. So these are really 30,000 feet view vision and challenges I think the community has in embedded system development. So now if you look at one of the problem statements that we have, that is the somewhat unique to the space, is that any security mechanism has to be able to take into account the dynamics of the physical systems themselves. So for example, as part of your response mechanism, you say that this actuator needs to close. There is a certain physical constraint on how quickly this response mechanism can be put in place. So any security mechanism, which we often think in purely cyber terms, now also has to take into account physical properties like these. And an important and somewhat unique aspect of a small sub-community within this that's grown up is to look at the human in the picture. So when you're talking about securing embedded systems, you're not just talking about expert security administrators who are responsible for managing, patching, maintaining these kinds of systems. You are looking at a larger segment of the population, many of which do not have formal security training, who are responsible for keeping them up to the mark. So how do humans, under various stress conditions, under various imperfect knowledge about what are the pros and cons, make decisions? That's, I think, another somewhat of a unique challenge in this space. So I'm going to delve one level deep and talk about one solution direction in this space that we and several others in the community are exploring, which is called randomization. So this is an aspect which has been very widely successful in the traditional server and desktop class world. And of late, there is effort to see if this could also be applied in the embedded world. And our initial foray into this has pointed out some very tough technical challenges. So what does randomization mean? So at a high level, randomization means that anything that can be the target of an attack, you randomize in your specific instance of the device. For example, if the target of the attack could be certain vulnerable parts of the code, you randomize the code so that you don't know exactly where that vulnerable function is going to lie. Okay? So this has the property that you cannot just acquire one device, reverse engineer the firmware, the software of it, and now you can target all the other devices which fall in that family. So randomization has the goal, which it has achieved to a significant extent, that disallows those kinds of attacks. Now, when you try to apply randomization in the embedded world, there are two fundamental problems that you run into. The first is you are operating in a fairly resource-constrained environment, meaning the amount of memory that you have, the amount of flash that you have is much more limited than your server class world. What that means is the amount of entropy that you can gain by randomization is much, much limited compared to your traditional computing devices. The second one is in embedded system operation, there are two key things which you have to take into account when you build security mechanisms. One key thing is you cannot perturb the running time significantly. Then your elevator is not going to reach here in 5 seconds. Okay? And almost as importantly, you cannot introduce too much variability in the operation of your embedded system. So if the elevator takes 5 seconds in one run and 10 seconds in another run, it's not going to fly. So any security mechanism that you build in has to bound the degradation and the variability in resource usage or performance, and traditional randomization does not have this as one of its challenges. So one of our early forays into this was published in Oakland last year, which was, I think, really touching the tip of this iceberg of how do you do randomization and still achieve these domain-specific goals. So this is what a typical embedded software stack looks like. You have a single execution domain, which is root. You have little to no, you have some security hardware in there, which you can configure, but that's trivially bypassable. Just by overwriting one register, you can bypass the protection provided by security hardware. You have a set of sensitive I/O pins, I/O peripherals. For example, when you go to your hotel room and you hold your electronic key card there, then there is an I/O pin which interacts with the door, and then it lets you in if it authenticates. So there are some I/O pins which are sensitive, and any vulnerability can basically write anything to these sensitive I/O pins. And then it's vulnerable to a whole bunch of these control and data attacks, stack smashing, code injection, global data corruption, and there are no defenses against what's called a return-oriented programming attack. This is something that was discovered 10 years ago. People have come up with defenses against it, but embedded systems primarily lack, pretty much universally lack protection layers. Okay, so why is defense hard? So why can't we just simply take the best practices, the best lessons that we have from the server class world and apply them to the embedded world? So part of it is certainly an engineering challenge. The low cost for each device, the large deployed base of these devices, and the time to market, those are sort of semi-technical, non-technical, or commercial reasons. But there are also some fundamental technical reasons into this. One is that oftentimes these run as a single binary image without any separation of privileges between, say, what's an OS or a kernel and what's application. So this means that a vulnerability anywhere in your software stack can basically make that entire device vulnerable. The second one is that there is a pretty large root of trust which is used, which is assumed in these kinds of devices. Then some hardware mechanisms which are used for providing protection in the server world, like memory management unit or virtualization, are not available in this world. And finally, they have small memory sizes, and as I mentioned earlier, tight constraints on the running time overhead as well as the variable. So one of our solutions is called epoxy, which I of course won't get into the details, but and you can read the details in our security and privacy paper. But the basic idea there is that instead of having everything run as root, can you automatically create multiple privilege levels in this kind of software and switch between these privilege levels and enforce the privilege levels using available hardware that you have on these devices. So as a result, you basically enforce this very well-known principle in security, which all of you know, is this principle of least privilege. I give the code the least privilege that it needs to operate. And this is the first attempt at bringing this kind of a principle into the embedded world. Now, this would be a segue to what CERIAS is going to present on. So what happens if all this fancy technique that so many of us are developing, you cannot apply that universally at all the devices? Because of cost reasons, performance reasons, you have to pick and choose. Okay? So you can go to the pointy-haired security guru who will tell you, secure these 10% of these devices, or you could do something a little more rigorous with this. So our attempt at doing this has been to create like an attack graph, which shows what are all the different paths through which an adversary can get into your embedded system and reach the crown jewel. And then do some kind of an inferencing on this attack graph, which will identify, based on certain threat model and threat perception, which are the devices which you need to secure. Okay? So here's a very high-level picture of an attack graph. You have various attack steps. And then some of these attack steps have attached to them some response mechanism or security protection mechanism. And work that we have done 10 years back in the traditional world and now more recently in the embedded world allows you to use something called Bayesian inferencing to decide exactly to which nodes should you attach these security protections so as to maximize an objective function. And the objective function here is that you don't reach the crown jewel unimpeded. Okay? So anybody who's interested, you can read our papers, talk to us, and I'll hand over to Shreyas for the next part.
Perfect. Thanks, Saurabh. Can everybody hear me with this? The back's good? Okay, excellent. Saurabh mentioned he started out by explaining that we're looking at these large-scale interdependent cyber-physical systems consisting of multiple stakeholders who are all responsible for securing some part of the system, the assets that they manage. And so in the second part of the talk, we're going to be taking sort of a higher level picture and looking at it from the perspective of these different stakeholders and trying to understand how do we systematically and rigorously reason about the decisions that these stakeholders make to invest in security. Where do they invest in security? They're often operating in a distributed or decentralized manner. They don't necessarily talk to each other. And so what kinds of outcomes can arise there? And in particular, how do human biases impact the security decisions? Okay, so this is work that's done with Saurabh and Professor Tim Kaysen, who is in economics. And so we're going to be bringing together ideas from game theory and behavioral economics and psychology to be trying to understand some of these issues here. So just a brief kind of primer on game theory, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. Many of you are probably quite familiar. So game theory considers scenarios with multiple decision makers, or also known as players. Okay, and each player has an available set of actions that they could take. And each player gets a benefit or a cost that depends on the action that they take and the actions that the other players take. Okay, the fact that your benefit or cost depends on the actions of the other players is what makes this a game. Okay, and this benefit and cost are captured by a utility function. And so game theory basically says, given a set of players, a set of actions they could take, and their utility functions, what kinds of actions arise in this type of environment when each player is trying to optimize their own utility function. So when they're acting in a selfish manner. Okay, so classical examples of prisoner's dilemma. Probably many of you are familiar, right? So you have two players in this case, which are the two prisoners. The cops catch them, put them in separate cells, and each prisoner is given two options. You can either remain quiet or you can testify against the other prisoner. And depending on what you do, the amount of time that you serve is going to get impacted. Okay, and so the utilities can be captured via a matrix like this, where in every cell there are two numbers. The first number indicates how many years the first prisoner will serve, and the second number indicates how many years the second prisoner would serve under those actions. So if both prisoners remain quiet, they would both serve 5 years. Okay, so now if you look at this scenario here and you try and figure out what prisoner 2 would do, well, you notice that no matter what prisoner 1 does, it's always beneficial for prisoner 2 to testify, right? So they would serve 5 years here, but if they testified, they would reduce their time to 3. If prisoner 1 testified, they would serve 10 years, but if the prisoner 2 also testified, they'd reduce their time to 8. Okay, so no matter what player 2 does, it's always best for player 1 to testify, and vice versa. And so in this case, when they're operating in this sort of distributed decision-making environment, both players end up testifying, and they both get sent away for 8 years. However, you can see that the optimal outcome for both players, if they were to coordinate and agree beforehand, would have been for both to remain quiet, and they would have both gotten away with 5 years. Okay, so this is common in game theoretic settings where selfish decision-making leads to suboptimal outcomes for both players because they're all trying to selfishly optimize their own utility function without necessarily considering what could happen if they coordinated. Okay, so the key concept in game theory that captures this idea is known as the Nash equilibrium. So this is named after John Nash. And so the idea here is that if you have a set of players playing a set of actions, that set of actions is said to be a Nash equilibrium if no player can benefit by deviating unilaterally when every other player is keeping their actions fixed. Right? So in the prisoner's dilemma, both players testifying is a Nash equilibrium because if I'm testifying, I get no benefit from remaining quiet if the other player is still testifying. Okay, so you can have different types of Nash equilibria. You could have pure Nash equilibria where each player picks a specific action, or you can have mixed where players randomize over their actions. So an example in a security game would be as follows. So suppose you have two players, an attacker and a defender, and there are two targets. Okay, and the attacker has two actions they could take. They could either attack target 1 or target 2. And similarly, the defender has to choose which target to defend. Okay, they don't know what the other is going to pick a priori. But the defender wins if she picks the same target as the attacker, because then she gets to intercept the attacker. And the attacker wins if he picks a different target from the defender, because then he gets to attack successfully. Okay, and so you can capture that again using a utility matrix like this. So for example, if they pick the same target, the defender gets a benefit of 1, the attacker gets a benefit of -1 because they lose. And if they pick different targets, then the defender loses and the attacker wins. Okay, so in this case, for example, you can check that there's no pure Nash equilibrium. So if the defender picked target 1, the attacker would pick target 2, but then the defender would like to choose target 2, but that would make the attacker choose target 1, and so forth. So there's no set of actions that everybody would be happy with and would not want to deviate from. But there is a mixed Nash equilibrium in this setting, where the defender chooses a target to defend with 50% probability each, and the attacker chooses a target with 50% probability each. Okay? And so then this maybe makes sense in a security context, right, where there's some randomization that's happening, there's uncertainty that's injected into these actions to either fool the defender or fool the attacker, and so often you see these types of mixed strategies show up, or probabilistic outcomes show up in these security settings. Okay, so that's classical game theory. But classical game theory also assumes certain things about the decision makers, for example, that they're purely rational, that they're looking at all these different outcomes and choosing the thing that's best for them, or that they're risk averse in certain ways and so forth. But behavioral economics and psychology has shown that humans actually don't fall into these classical models. They systematically deviate from these models in certain ways. And there's a huge literature in this area, and there are a couple of Nobel Prizes that have been awarded for this. But for example, prospect theory, which is one very common instance of behavioral decision making, posits certain things. So for example, humans perceive values in certain ways. We don't just look at the absolute value of outcomes. We compare them to references. So for winning or losing, we behave in different ways based on that. There's diminishing sensitivity. So the difference between $0 and $1 million feels like a lot, but the difference between $1 million and $2 million doesn't feel as much. Okay? Similarly, loss aversion. If I win $1, I feel like I'm winning $1. If I lose $1, I feel like I'm losing $5. Right? So I don't like losing, and so the same magnitude of loss hurts more than the magnitude of gain. So that's going to impact the way people make decisions. For example, if they're protecting assets that they could lose in their system. Similarly, perceptions or probabilities. Humans don't really understand probabilities very well or perceive probabilities in a linear fashion. Humans tend to overweight low probabilities, or that we think that low probability events occur more frequently than they do, and underweight high probability events. And in the middle range, we tend to have sort of a flat perception of probability. Okay, and so we're going to focus on this in particular here and understand how this sort of overweighting and underweighting of probabilities impacts the decisions that people make in security scenarios. Okay, so let's consider a class of interdependent security games. Going back to what Sarah was describing, we have a bunch of assets that are interconnected together. Each player is managing some subset of the assets, and they have to invest to protect their assets. The probability that their asset gets attacked is a function of the investment that they make and the investments that the other players in the system make. Okay, and so what happens if people misperceive those attack probabilities? So we've done a variety of different work in this space. We're going to consider a very simple model here to convey the main ideas. Suppose you have a network. Again, think of it as an attack graph. You have n nodes. Each node you can think of as a system or an asset. And each node has a defender who's protecting that asset. And let's say they have $1 to invest in securing that asset. Okay, and so they can invest some SI. Player I invests SI, which is some number between 0 and 1, to protect that asset. The probability that the node is successfully attacked depends not only on how much that player has put in, but on how much their neighbors have put in as well. So the node can get attacked directly or through other nodes that are connected to that node. So if my neighbors have not invested very much, then the node that I'm defending can also be vulnerable. Okay, and so one example of that is a total effort game where the probability that the node is attacked depends on the average investment in your neighborhood. Okay, and so if you look at this type of game under non-behavioral decision making, when everybody perceives probabilities in a linear fashion, then it turns out that the optimal investment for each player is sort of an all or nothing strategy. Okay, if it's beneficial for you to invest something in security, it's actually beneficial for you to put all your security budget into protecting that node. There's no point in you keeping anything back for yourself. Okay, on the other hand, if the risks are very high and your investment in security is not going to help you very much, it's better for you to just take your security budget and go invest it somewhere else and write off this node that's going to be attacked with high probability. Okay? So that's what happens when you have non-behavioral decision making. So then the question is, what happens if you have behavioral probability weighting? So what happens if people perceive these probabilities in this manner that we discussed earlier? Okay, and the first thing that comes out is that there's always a pure natural equilibrium in this game. And secondly, there's never a scenario where any node is left completely unprotected under behavioral probability weighting. And the reason for that is as follows. So consider this green line here, which shows this player, for example, who's overweighting low probabilities and underweighting high probabilities. Suppose that they're managing a node and they initially have no security investments on it, so that there's a 100% probability that that node would get attacked if the attacker targeted it. Now, this defender is thinking, okay, if I invest a little bit in security, what's going to happen? Well, the true probability of attack will go down, but their perceived probability of attack will go down significantly more. Okay? And so because they're underweighting this, because there's this kind of sharp drop in their perceived probability, they feel that a small investment in security actually makes a much bigger difference than it actually does, and they feel that it's worth it for them to invest in security. Okay? And so this ends up being a common theme in many of the things that we've seen in our research, and so this sort of helps to prevent these totally open systems. People tend to at least invest a little bit in security. Okay, similarly, is it better to have everybody be probability weighting? And the answer turns out to depend on the environment and the threat scenario. If you're in a scenario where you're in a very dense network and you have many neighbors, so you have a lot of vulnerability, a lot of paths for people to attack you, you have a high probability of attack. Okay, and in that scenario, it's better to have people who have this high probability weighting, because in this regime, they're going to all invest in security more because they feel like they're making a difference. In graphs where each player only has a moderate number of neighbors, they're not facing as big a security threat from their neighbors, so they're in the middle range here, and in that range, they don't feel like security investments make that much of a difference. The green line is a little bit flatter. So in those scenarios, people who have this probability weighting tend to invest less in security than people who perceive probabilities in a linear fashion. Okay, so if you're designing networks or if you're managing a large cyber-physical system and you're trying to figure out, should I train my employees to invest better in security or not, well, that's going to depend on whether you want them to have misperceptions of probability or not. If you're in a high-threat environment, maybe you want them to feel like what they're doing makes a bigger difference and therefore invest more in security. Yeah.
That explains marketing cost.
Marketing.
Cost, your previous matter.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay, and so we've also looked at, in the interest of time, I'll sort of, just give a high-level overview. You can also think about how do you design the interdependencies, right? So you may not be able to control the individual decision makers, but perhaps you can design the interdependencies between the assets in such a way that when you've deployed this big system and the different stakeholders are managing it, the decisions that they make will actually be okay in terms of the security of the overall system. So what kinds of graphs or interdependency structures are good in terms of minimizing the risk or the number of nodes that get successfully attacked? And the key insight turns out to be that you should collect all your edges in as few nodes as possible. So essentially, edges and interdependencies are what lead to risks because you have security attacks that are going through different nodes. And so if you concentrate all of that risk on a few nodes, you essentially write them off and you leave the other nodes to be as independent of the other nodes as possible. Okay, so this doesn't account for the fact that maybe you want interdependencies because there's functional dependencies and so forth, but if you're just trying to minimize risk, this is what you would sort of expect, and the math also fits this out. Yes?
Would this finding also contribute to sort of people's gut instinct of creating, say, bottlenecks where they can perform security investment?
Yeah, excellent. So what we're doing right now is ongoing research where you're looking at exactly these types of questions, particularly more complicated attack graph scenarios where you can think about a bottleneck. And interestingly enough, we are seeing that if you have behavioral decision making, the rational thing to do is to invest in bottlenecks and protect your system. The irrational or the behavioral weighting thing that comes out of this is that people tend to move investments away from bottlenecks because, again, they feel like they're making bigger differences elsewhere. There are very interesting things that are coming out of that. Okay, so I think with that, we basically looked at a variety of different issues pertaining to embedded system devices and large-scale cyber-physical systems and decisions at the higher level involving humans and what impacts behavioral decision-making can have. And we'd be happy to take any questions.
Hi, I'm Jim Graham of TrueSecure SCADA. I have an observation and also a question about part one of the talk. My observation is, as a guy that's out there protecting real-life systems, the goal of self-healing, real-time adaptation, and reconfigure to achieve mission objective is a goal that's way off. There may be some contractors selling the government systems. They claim will do that. I'm here to tell them it probably doesn't really work. So the real goal there should be to minimize mean time to fail, okay? You want to, as rapidly as possible, identify where the failure is, what the nature of the failure is, and give some guidance to human operators to repair, okay? So that should be the real goal there, not self-healing. Self-healing may be next century or something, but not now, not even close.
Does that mean time to fail and mean time to recover?
I'm sorry, mean time to recover, mean time to repair. Yeah, thanks, sorry.
So I completely agree with that sentiment.
Good.
And those bullets came almost directly out of a DARPA proposal.
Yeah.
So DARPA likes these grand vision
Yep.
kinds of things, as you would
And we
imagine.
all know where DARPA's thinking is, okay. So the question is whether or not you've looked into SEL4. It appears to me that it would handle some of the things that your epoxy system does. And I'm here to tell you also that we use that in our commercial products that we produce in my company. So it is a real thing. It's public domain available, and it really enforces a lot of the things you mentioned.
So we have looked at it, and it's a great code base for us to build on. The one challenge is that some classes of embedded devices they lack some of the hardware features that you would need to run SEL4 on it. So there is that trade-off.
Yeah,
And
very
it's-
good point. I mean, it is available on a limited number of processors right now, but they are expanding that.
So it's a very interesting research, both parts. And regarding the, sorry, I gotta look back at my notes. Regarding the first part, one thing that you said that I thought was very interesting was the notion of runtime diagnostics or monitoring of the system to be able to detect failures, compromises, et cetera. And what I hear sometimes from, say, control system vendors and stuff like that is, hey, that costs money. What should I monitor and what can I afford not to monitor? So I think that might be an interesting angle for both parts of this research. Is given that this is in effect an imperfect knowledge game, where does having extra knowledge or perfect knowledge help, and where does it not help?
Yeah, no, I think, and these are exactly the things that we're currently looking at, which is especially in these interdependent settings, we've been finding, for example, that having heterogeneity in terms of the knowledge can have a big impact in some cases beneficial, in some cases not. And so if we did want to focus on specific aspects of the system where the outcomes of the research would say, bad decision-making can lead to great vulnerabilities in this part of the system, that would then give us insights into where we can zoom in and better monitor systems in order to better train the people who are responsible for securing it. Yeah, those would be exactly the outcomes we're looking for.
So I'm Mark Graff. I've been involved for a long time in trying to encourage vendors to improve the security of their products, and it occurs to me that there's a couple of ways in which this work relates to that. You might be interested in looking into it. You talked about cyber defendants making risk decisions. I think also, and this goes back when in the 90s I was in charge of product security for Sun Microsystems, the vendors are making decisions all the time about whether they should invest more in security, more in product features. And I think it'd be interesting to look at how the game theory involved in how they make those trade-offs. The other thing, though, maybe it's even more interesting, is I was also involved in trying to promote the collaboration between vendors to improve the joint security of their product. And I think it's very, very interesting about looking at it from a vendor's point of view. Do they share information about perhaps security flaws in their designs with their competitors in order to jointly improve the state of the art? So I think it's very interesting and might be good to pursue.
Absolutely. Yeah, and both are actually themes in ongoing work that we have. How do you defend under partial knowledge models?